I thought I'd do something light. The U.S. budget, which is $4 trillion now. That's outlays, or what we spend. It's determined by a funding bill passed by Congress. Revenues are what we collect in taxes, so it depends on the economy. As in most years, we didn't collect as much as we spent, so we ended up with a deficit. That annual deficit accumulates over time to the debt. Warren Buffett once said that our government's goal should be to bring in revenues of 18.5% of gross domestic product and spend about 21%. GDP is how we typically measure the size of our economy. It's a total of everything sold by companies to customers. Buffett is recommending we intentionally run a deficit of 2.5% of GDP. That's a common view among economists. I'm picking on Buffett here only because I found this quote. I'll get back to that deficit later, but for now, let's apply that percent of GDP to the chart. These percentages are all relative to the blue bar on the right, which represents GDP. We're spending 21%, just as Buffett suggested, but our deficit is too big. That's because we're not collecting enough in taxes. So our revenues are 17% instead of the 18.5% that Buffett recommended. Before I continue, let's review. The annual deficit is the difference between the revenues and outlays. The debt is the accumulation of that deficit. What we haven't covered yet is the interest on that debt. And that's based on debt times interest rate. And we have to pay that interest, so it becomes a part of the budget. Here's about 50 years of outlays and revenues. You can see a big gap right at about 2008. That's the Great Recession. And now you can see that that makes a big deficit. If I add in debt, there's not enough room, so I'll squish it down. Now you can see that the debt is 3 times higher now than it was in 2008. There's this one little section here where the deficit was actually a surplus. Let's take a closer look at that. We had a surplus because we collected more taxes than we spent. So you can see the blue line under the orange line. That surplus was used to pay down the debt. And that's why the yellow line goes down slightly. That's the only surplus we've had in the past 50 years. Now let's look at the same history as a percentage of gross domestic product by pushing that GDP line right to the top. Look at outlays and revenues, the blue and orange lines. They're both right at about 20%. I hope you're surprised by that because as a percentage of GDP, the budget does not appear to be growing out of control. Look at the debt, the yellow line, just to the left of the surplus. It looks like it's going down a little bit when we know there's no surplus. That happens in a few places now that we're looking at it as a percentage of GDP. That deserves an explanation because it gets at why Buffett recommended running a small deficit. In 1995, there was a deficit of $0.2 trillion. That's the same as 200 billion, but I'm sticking to trillions. That caused the debt to increase by 0.2 trillion. That's a 4.8% gain. But at the same time, GDP increased by even more. So as a percentage of GDP, that debt appears to decline. This is exactly why Buffett is fine with running a small deficit. Now I've added in interest on the debt, but it's too small to really see here, so I'll change the scale again to a logarithmic scale. Now you can see that it was highest in the 80s and 90s. But how can that be if the debt is higher now than it's ever been? That's because the interest rate is much lower now. It dropped sharply in 2001 when the dot-com bubble popped, rose again when housing prices rose, and dropped again for the Great Recession. If it ever gets above 5%, like it usually is, the interest payment will be a quarter of our budget. So now you can see why an increasing debt might become a problem. That's really everything I wanted to tell you about the U.S. budget. But I do have these breakdowns that are interesting. I'll pick on one expense here, and that's defense. It's considered discretionary because there are fewer obligations to pay it. Back in 1970, that was 40% of our budget. Now it's half that. So some other part of the budget must have increased. It was Medicare more than any other. As for taxes, you can see most of it is payroll and income taxes. The data for this came right from the Congressional Budget Office. If you want to take a closer look at this, here's the link. I would really appreciate a thumbs up or a comment in YouTube on this video, and thanks for watching.